Fox Business' Connell McShane with us, Dow Jones genius Glenn Hall, independent Women's Forum's Hadley Heath Manning. So, Connell, maybe give us an update, what you're hearing and the timeline we're looking at.
Well, the direction that Marco Rubio wanted this to all go to in terms of how much would be added to the child tax credit looks like it's going in his direction. Now, it's been so much minutia today as to whether or not it would get done. Timeline-wise, we have it up on the screen now, is fairly aggressive. I mean, they want this thing to be released and finalized by today. Then you start the debates next week. You get the votes getting going. Then by midweek, the plan still is to have the president signing it into law, which is interesting because once you get to the end of next week, and it's not being talked about as much today, again, because we're talking about all the details of getting this particular bill passed, you run up against that other deadline, making sure the government's funded and not shutting down by next Friday. So still trying to get all of that done before then seems to be the rule.
Yeah, I hear you. Glenn, the one thing you immediately think of, right, is as soon as a concession is made to one senator to keep him or her in line, you're going to tick off somebody else, right?
You're going to hear others saying how we pay for it, right?
Right.
And they've also got a
Which
mandate.
Has been, Bob Corker's big gripe, and why he was a no vote going in, right? Might still remain a no vote.
That's the challenge, right? And they've got to keep it under that $1.5 trillion cap, which is the budget bill that they're working under. So those are restrictions that are real. That said, this new move up to $1,400 per child from $1,100 crosses that 55% threshold that Marco Rubio tweeted about this morning, gets you to 70% of the old number, which was 2,000.
Right.
So if he's in, then we only have to wonder, they got 2 votes to work with, right, in terms of losing anybody.
Who are those 2 votes? Susan Collins, potentially?
Well, not just those, but also the risk from John McCain and Thad Cochran's illnesses and whether they're going to be available to vote as well.
All right. Hadley, we still don't know how we got up to the $1,400 credit, that both of these gentlemen referred to. Has there been any other news that we're missing here, that either the top rate won't go down to 37% or the corporate rate won't just settle at 21, maybe higher? Do we know?
Well, it's going to have to be one of those options or some other creative solution that we haven't mentioned yet. I think the 2 angles here really are the political one and the policy one. From a political perspective, I believe Senator Rubio's been negotiating in good faith. It's one thing to be a no vote, and it's another thing to have an issue like this that you've said for a long time will be what it takes to get your vote. And it'll be a political win for him if he gets this. The policy side, however, is different. There's more than one way to do tax relief for lower income families. The child tax credit, in fact, may not be the best way to do that, but there's trade-offs involved, and we'll see what ultimately the Republicans come up with.
That's an interesting point that Hadley makes, because there's trade-offs involved. At this point, the bill's closed, right? So there won't be any more
I would think
changes to it. So we may not know. If we don't know what those trade-offs are now, someone who's opposed to the trade-offs, and correct me if I'm wrong, wouldn't know what they are either, and then wouldn't have a chance to kind of make their case.
But they're voting
anymore.
on a blueprint of something, right? They're going to say this is what we've agreed to.
There are this is a conference committee bill, right? So they're putting it out. The members of the conference committee are signing off on it right now, and they're intending to release it by the end of the day today in order to keep that timeline.
What's to stop me if Senator Johnson and I wanted better treatment of smaller businesses, pastors, et cetera, and I find out it came out of my hide, or they changed the allowance a little bit,
it's too late
and I won't find out until the last second.
You're going to change your vote then? And
I see. Hadley, I don't envision any of this happening. I think there's such enormous pressure right now to get this done that each side will argue those who pushed for concessions got what they wanted. What do you think?
Yeah, ultimately, Republicans, I think, have learned a hard lesson from the debacle that was their attempt at health reform this summer, and they understand that if they're going to be a no vote on this, then effectively they would be making perfect the enemy of the good. And I don't think we should think about this tax reform bill as the be-all, end-all, comprehensive reform. We can continue to look at capital gains tax reform or removing some unfair treatment that green energy companies enjoy. This current bill doesn't take those things on, but we can continue to make improvements in our tax code.
But you can't take them on if you're majority is whittled down or you don't even have a majority. That's a real fear, right?
Well, that's why they need a win, Neil.
Yeah, I know you're right.
That's why they need a win.
That's been their thinking.
That 2-vote majority slims down to 1 vote come the new year.
That's a big part, isn't it? That Alabama timing of the election and Doug Jones coming in.
Well, yeah, Chad Pergram's talked a lot about this, about the government shutdown deadline being next Friday. So then Congress, is supposed to go on their regular Christmas recess after that, but say that the government, and this is not out of the to question that it would shut down, because that's probably a thornier issue, by the way, than getting the votes there than it is for the tax cuts. Then do they have to come back and continue to work on that the week after? By that point, say the day after Christmas, the result in Alabama would probably be certified, and Doug Jones could theoretically be sworn in, which would take, to your point, one vote off the margin. The Republicans have be 51-49 instead of 52-48. So that's just another complication.
You know, part of this whole tax cut, guys, has been this notion that it will really help Republicans. Not only that it will be their big legislative victory and some wind at their back, but that people will feel it. What if they don't? You know, big tax cuts historically have gone to votes with a minority of Americans liking them, at least going into them. Now, they learn to appreciate them sometime after the fact. Ronald Reagan's were a good example. But this might not be felt by next November, right?
Well, there is one obvious way that it'll be felt. Like that big personal deduction, right, is going to be an obvious way that people can see. It's going to simplify the tax code a little bit for many people, and they still have itemized options.
But you don't take that deduction until you're doing your taxes after next year.
That's right. They're not going to know it this year.
But next year is when you're going to be going through the midterms. In other words, you're not filling out your taxes.
That's right.
I'm not trying to trivialize the argument. I'm just trying to say that when do people feel it? They'll see it in their net and their paychecks.
I was going to say it's going to be in their paychecks, and if they can see those paychecks going up a little bit, they're going to feel satisfied. If they don't see that, and if it takes longer to implement, because that's a whole big technological challenge itself, that could delay. But I think they're going to feel it in their paychecks before we get to voting season.
We do know that usually within 6 months after a tax cut, again, I know it depends to all our points here when certain things are phased in, but we do see a smile on a lot of people's faces. Now, obviously, Hadley, you hope that a lot of people are smiling. But what if they're not?
Ultimately, I think that this is going to come down to not just the changes in the individual tax code, but the changes on the corporate side. People aren't wrong when they're saying that the biggest change in our tax code will be the reduction of the corporate rate from 35 to about 21%. And we don't have the advantage of living in an alternative universe where we would see what happens, if these tax reforms end up failing. I think there's an expectation built into our markets and built into our businesses that we're going to see some kind of tax reforms. And Republicans are going to have to make the case that this is beneficial not just to shareholders and people who have pensions and people who depend on those investments, but to workers themselves. And we know when corporate tax rates have been cut in other countries, workers have seen increased wage growth. So we want that here in the U.S. as well.
But there's no guarantee
Republicans are going to have to make that argument.
That'll happen. I mean, Mike Bloomberg wrote an op-ed today that I was just actually reading before I came down here that makes the case that this is $1 trillion mistake, largely based on that the fact that, corporations, in his view at least, don't, quote unquote, need the money. So that if they were going to spend their money on their own businesses and, or to Hadley's point, raise wages, they would have already done it because there's a lot of money already on the sidelines. So he says adding more money to that doesn't necessarily guarantee that they're going to do that. There's no incentive. It's not like because we give the corporations.
What if the worst they do, though, is plow it back into their stock?
Right. So that maybe exactly, and that might help. Again, shareholders might very well.
Cynicism that is just what we fear. These guys are going to enrich themselves and all, but what exactly.
As far as sentiment goes, we've seen in the market, when they looked like the tax bill was under threat, we saw it hit the market. Today, we see it going back up because it looks like it's coming through. That translates into sentiment in the economy writ large. And if that momentum continues, I think you see the positive impact.
Interesting.
And strengthening the financial picture for big employers like big businesses. And this tax bill would include some changes for small businesses that could be beneficial as well. But I think if you ask the majority of Americans if they'd rather work for an employer that's in a good financial shape or a poor financial shape, they'd say the better financial shape is the place where they want to be at work, because that means more security for their employment and for their
that's a very good point. If they had their druthers, would I like my boss to be financially stable or not? That's an interesting way to frame it.
Well, the left is gonna pull the political class warfare card as soon as this bill gets signed. That's going to be their number one talking point. So
well,
it's going to be.
Know a lot of people on the left do like working for a boss who's fiscally sound, whether that boss is conservative or liberal. But we'll watch it closely. Hadley, Connell, Glenn, thank you.